So the United States is talking about changing its tax system, and that might include tax cuts. So I figured it would be a good opportunity to talk about a paradox that seems to appear when it comes to tax policy. And that is, there's a consensus among economists that if you raise taxes, it's going to have a negative impact on the economy. But then if you come along and cut those taxes back to where they were before, the economy doesn't suddenly jump back to where it was before. So in order to explain that, I need to point out a common mistake that Republicans make when it comes to tax policy. And in order to do that, I have to explain a common mistake that Democrats make when it comes to tax policy as well. So I'm going to be talking pretty broadly. I'm not addressing any particular policy in particular. So this, even though I'm using the United States and Democrats and Republicans as examples, this could apply for pretty much any other country. I'm going to start with Democrats because in order to cut taxes, you first have to have raised taxes, or at the very least there has to be taxes there to cut. And so the thing is, the Democrats, it's not that the Democrats like raising taxes just for fun. It's part of their overall fiscal policy. Democrats believe in a lot of government spending, for healthcare and providing education and protecting the environment and infrastructure, etc. The basic idea is that if the government spends money, that money is going to be available to the people. The people then are going to go out and buy stuff with it, which is going to cause economic growth. This is basically demand side economics. But the thing is, if the government is spending a lot of money, then the fiscally responsible thing to do is, since the only source of income that the government has is taxes, you have to raise taxes to compensate for the increased expenditure. The thing is, when you raise taxes, well, those taxes come out of the economy. So essentially, you're taking money out of one pocket and putting it into another pocket. So in order for this to work, you have to be spending the money on things that are more important or that are going to produce more benefit for society than where you're taking that money from. So Democrats typically solve this problem by saying, well, we'll just go and tax the rich. The rich have a whole bunch of money. They use their money for yachts and vacations to Tahiti and penthouses, which is stuff that really doesn't help our society and economy as much as, giving people education and healing the sick. And this is where the Democrats make their mistake when it comes to tax policy, because they go and say, well, we're focusing on helping the poor and the needy, and who cares about the rich? They've got a bunch of money. We don't really consider what happens when we tax the rich, because they're rich, they got money, who cares? Thing is, when you raise taxes, it does have an impact on the people whose taxes you are raising, and they're going to have different reactions to it. And generally, the problem is the Democrats don't consider these reactions. Well, if you apply taxes to people's salaries, people that have salaries, if they have their taxes raised, they don't have very much wiggle room when it comes what to do or have different options when it comes to their taxation. They just have to pay the taxes. So it makes sense from the Democratic perspective that raising taxes means that if you raise taxes on someone, that person is going to pay more taxes. But when it comes to business owners, they have a lot more wiggle room. And this applies broadly from the really ultra rich down to the guy that owns a corner store, the family-owned corner store. They also follow within the same principles, though usually the big multinational corporation has more options than the corner store. But this applies pretty much broadly to all of them. So and the other thing is, when you tax the rich, typically the rich did not get rich through their salaries. They got rich through owning businesses. So when you're taxing the rich, you're taxing primarily business owners or people who have invested in business. And the reaction is going to be pretty much the same whether you're taxing the business owner or you're taxing the business itself. And generally speaking, Democrats like taxing businesses because businesses, well, they're not human, they don't have feelings, and more importantly, they don't vote. And the thing is, when you tax a business owner who's in this model is relatively wealthy, that business owner gets their money from their business. That's the source of their income, and they have their business and they run their business and they work in their business in order to provide the lifestyle to which they've become accustomed. And so what happens is, if you raise taxes on them, their reaction is going to want to keep living in their lifestyle. So if the cost of their living has gone up in the form of taxes, then they're just going to take more money out of their business. essentially passing the cost of the raising taxes onto the business, generally speaking. And the thing is, this has a negative impact on the business because taking more money out of the business means it has less money available to develop new products, to expand into new markets, to hire new people, and to raise wages. So basically, when you tax the rich, you're basically taxing businesses. It's kind of an ultra simplification here, but that's the point that I'm getting at. So when taxes are raised on the rich, or on businesses, businesses have different options of how to deal with that situation. So the first thing, and we could call this the ideal situation because that's what Democrats expect to happen, is that when you tax a business, the business eats that tax cost. So in other words, the paying for the taxes comes out of the profit of the business. But this has a negative impact overall on the business because if it doesn't have as much money as it did before, well, it can't expand into new markets, it can't hire new people, and it can't raise wages. And this is what leads to that slowing in economic growth. That's the consensus that most economics had that I mentioned at the beginning. But also, it makes it a lot harder for that business to run, and it makes that business a lot more vulnerable to going bankrupt if something happens that negatively impacts the business. It's harder for that business to get loans because it doesn't have as much profitability. It's harder for that company to get investors. And this is without considering how unhappy the owners of the company is going to be because now they're not making as much money. So what does the business do about this? Well, they can go to option number 2. And option number 2 is that they raise their prices, right? So the thing is, and there's a meme going around, I guess, that's supported by a lot of Democrats when it comes to the Trump wall between the United States and Mexico. One of the proposals for financing the wall is to tax Mexican imports to the United States. And so a lot of Democrats are saying, well, if you do that, if you put a tax on Mexican imports, then what Mexican exporters are going to do is they're just going to raise prices to compensate for that increase in taxes, and then Americans are going to end up paying for the border wall, right? Well, American businesses do the same thing within the United States when you raise taxes on them. You see, the price of goods is determined by the competition of two forces. On the one hand, you have businesses trying to make more money, and then on the other hand, you have people who don't want to pay as much. And this takes a little bit of time to establish itself, but then you get the market price. So I, as a business owner, I can't raise taxes unilaterally because then my customers are going to go to the competition and I'm ultimately going to end up losing money. And then I can't lower from market prices because I'm not going to be making enough profitability. So when you raise taxes on the business, that is an increase in the cost of doing business across the board for all businesses, including my company and my competition. So if you raise taxes on my business, then I can raise I can raise the prices of the product or service that I'm offering because I know that all my competition are suffering from the same problem, and so, well, they're going to raise their prices too, most likely. And we can see this with any increased cost of business. If the cost of flour goes up, then the cost of bread goes up. Taxes just basically increase the cost of doing business, which usually translates to an increase in prices of those businesses that are taxed. So essentially, when you tax the rich, you are taking that money from the customers of the businesses from which those rich people gain their income, which is why when you raise taxes on the rich, there's not a significant drop in the sales of yachts and fancy cars and penthouses and trips to Tahiti. But this is only for companies that are within your jurisdiction, and we're not considering what happens outside of that tax jurisdiction, whether that's a county or a state or an entire country. And what happens is if you raise taxes on your businesses within your jurisdiction, the prices, those companies, they're going to raise prices potentially, but if they raise prices, then they're going to be more expensive than competing the products and services from other states, counties, or other countries. And that is going to make them less competitive. And for the companies that can't move out of your jurisdiction, that is going to make it harder for them to do business. But it's also going to provide an extreme motivation for for companies within your jurisdiction to move out. And this is a lot easier for really big companies than it is for smaller companies. And this is an advantage that raising taxes provides to really big companies. Now, there's a thing about this that really isn't considered. Well, let's consider a company that's in, say, Kansas, and it manufactures something. I think the technical economic term is widgets. It manufactures widgets for $100, and I'm just throwing out numbers here. It costs them $50 to make, and then they have to pay $20 in taxes. So their profitability is $30. Right? And it costs them $70 to operate. Now, this company in Kansas could potentially make their products in Mexico for only $60. And that is actually cheaper than what it is for them to make in the United States. But they don't move to Mexico, and there's several reasons why. One of them is that the company, even though it's cheaper for them to work in Mexico, the owners and the executives of the company, well, they grew up in the United States, they're American, all their friends and family are in Kansas, so they don't have any they would rather stay where they are, even if that means even if it costs them a little bit more or they have a little bit less profit. Also, things are cheaper in Mexico, and here's Mexico is a stand-in for any other cheaper manufacturing country, including Thailand and Vietnam and India or wherever else you're going to outsource to. They have potentially higher corruption and higher crime rates, so that isn't much of a motivation to go there. And also, and this is the really big one, is if a company is going to move overseas, then it has to go to that country and buy land or lease it and build a manufacturing plant and buy machinery and hire new workers and train new workers, and all that is a really big expense. So even though they could potentially be making less money by going overseas, they don't, because they have more advantages staying in the United States. But if you raise taxes enough, now it no longer is, it becomes financially viable for that company to move overseas. So if they were being taxed previously $20, and it cost them $50 to produce their product, it cost them $70 to do their business. And they couldn't do it for $60 in Mexico. The incentive wasn't enough for them to move to Mexico. But if you raise taxes another $10, so now it costs them $80 to work in the United States, but they can do it for $60 in Mexico, well, now it makes economic sense for them to move. And they most likely do in this circumstance. So what happens in terms of fiscal policy is that if the company moves overseas, or if the company goes bankrupt, what happens is the companies that additionally supply that company, they also will either move out or they will go bankrupt. And that means you're going to have a loss of revenue for your jurisdiction, your state, well, if we're talking about Kansas, we're talking about state. So the state has less income, and you have a whole bunch of unemployed who are now dependent on state benefits. So the cost for the state goes up. So you have increased deficit. So the fiscally responsible Democrat is going to say, well, we need to keep raising taxes. So if you raise taxes again, that causes more companies either to go out of business or move out, and then you end up in this sort of taxation bankruptcy moving spiral that leads you to, well, Detroit. The other option is that in comes a Republican. And a Republican says, well, raising taxes is the reason all these companies moved overseas in the first place. So what we need to do is we need to cut taxes. Vote for me. I'm going to cut taxes. I'm going to bring these businesses back. You're going to get your jobs back. Let's make Kansas great again. Except, this is the mistake that the Republicans generally make, is that they don't consider what happened when that company moved down to Mexico. See, the company is now in Mexico, and it's making its widgets for $60 and selling them for $100. If you lower taxes in Kansas back to where it was, it's going to go back to costing $70 per widget. There's no motivation for that company to move back to the United States from a financial standpoint. It's actually going to cost them more money to go back to the United States, even though you lowered taxes to where it was before. Because the reason that the company stayed there before, even though it cost them more, is because it already was there. Moving to Mexico was very expensive. And then moving from Mexico back to the United States is also going to be very expensive. So they don't have any incentive to spend a lot of money to then go and make less money. And then additionally, the really big thing here is that when the company moved out, it sold all of its infrastructure that it had in the United States. So in order for it to move back, it's going to have to buy all that stuff again, which is going to be a major investment. And typically this kind of investment takes between 5 and 10 years to recover. But the next election is going to be in 4 years. So the tax cut is going to be as long as the Republican is in office, and he kind of insists on, you make sure you keep voting for me because I'm going to keep the taxes low and that's going to keep the businesses here. But if the Democrats come in, they're going to raise taxes, and the Democrats keep saying that they're going to raise taxes. So that company has no guarantee that if it moves back and it's going to take 5 to 10 years to recover its investment, within 4 years a Democrat might come in and then raise taxes again, and then it's going to be in the situation it was before it moved out. So what happens is, in this scenario, is even though the Republican has come in and lowered taxes, presumably this means that the economy is going to grow. It doesn't, because there's no motivation for the companies that have already left to come back. And then also you have the companies that went bankrupt. Well, they don't suddenly come back from the dead just because you lowered taxes. The second thing, or the second option that companies did, the companies that couldn't move overseas but then raise their prices, well, they're very reluctant to lower their prices even though taxes have dropped. You see, because when you raise taxes, the company has a strong motivation to raise prices on its goods and the goods and services that it produces, because the taxes have an immediate negative impact on its bottom line. But when you have or when it's in a situation where its prices are higher and you lower taxes, that doesn't have a negative impact on its bottom line. And then secondly, it's really easy for that company to lower taxes, so they'll wait for the competition to lower them. So if I lower my prices as a business owner, I could get more customers to come to me, which is the whole point of lowering taxes. But then all the other companies are in a similar situation, so nothing prevents those other companies from also immediately lowering prices, and then my customers are going to go away. I'm not going to actually gain any new customers by lowering the price. So basically what happens is, when you lower taxes, prices don't necessarily go down, or they don't go down as fast, because all the companies that were benefited from the lowering taxes are just waiting for their competition to lower taxes. And if everyone's waiting for everyone else to lower prices, then those prices are going to take a long time to go down, if they go down at all, or they'll just be, or inflation is just going to catch up to them. And then the final factor is that businesses require a lot of infrastructure, and this is the case where we have with Kansas, because Kansas is relatively isolated. There's not a huge population that lives in Kansas compared to, say, California or Texas or New York. And in order to have a business, it needs a certain amount of infrastructure. So if you have a car manufacturing business, that car manufacturing business needs raw materials. It needs steel, it needs aluminum, it needs copper, it needs plastic, it needs tires, etc. So if that car manufacturing company moves out of your state, then all those supplying companies are also going to move out of the state. But now there's a less incentive for that car company to move back into your state, because all the support businesses no longer exist. So it's going to be a lot more expensive for that company to move back into your state than it was just to keep the company there in the first place. And this is something that lowering taxes does not fix that infrastructure problem. And this is why you can have a situation like, for example, Kansas lowers its taxes, and businesses don't move to Kansas even though it has lower taxes, but they do move to California, which has higher taxes, because California has the business infrastructure that makes it easier or cheaper for those businesses to operate in California. So this allows a lot of Democrats to point to California and say, hey, look, California is doing really well despite having high taxes, and Kansas is doing really bad because, and even though it has lower taxes, this whole cutting taxes thing doesn't work, or having low taxes doesn't work. That is because of the different levels of infrastructure and also the amount of population. If you're manufacturing cars in Kansas and then you have to export them back to California, it costs money to send them to California. You're better off just building your manufacturing in California, where you have all the infrastructure to build the cars and you have your customer base right there. It might be, even though you have to pay more taxes, it might actually end up being cheaper for you. So what kind of solution does this raising taxes, lowering taxes have? Well, in the first place, you have to be more considerate and circumspect when it comes to raising taxes in the first place. And then secondly, just lowering taxes is not going to be enough to really get the economy going. You still have to work on the infrastructure, and you still have to entice those companies that did go overseas. Well, maybe they're going to stay overseas because even though you return taxes to where they were, it's still not going to be profitable for them to come back. And then secondly, they don't have any guarantee that whatever profitability they get because of lower taxes is going to be permanent, because, well, those taxes can be raised with the next government that comes along. So anyway, hopefully you like this video and learned something from it. If you'd like to know more or see more stuff like this, you can subscribe over here. And there's another video over here about financial stuff, and then I do occasionally videos about historic oddities. So thanks for watching and have a good one.